Hi, everybody. Daniel McCormack. I'm Head of Thought Leadership at Macquarie Asset Management, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Peter Durante, who's Head of Technology and Innovation. Peter, welcome to the webinar.
Hey, Daniel. Good to see you.
So today's presentation is on decarbonisation of electricity generation. It's based on a paper that we wrote recently, and that paper is available in the dashboard and will be available on Savvy's website. So if you would like to download it, please do. But the electricity sector is really, fundamental to achieving net zero by 2050. So this is the second paper in our Path to Net Zero series. Our first paper looked at some of the aggregate challenges of reaching net zero by 2050, and each subsequent paper is going to dive into some of the specific sectors that will help us get there, and some of the changes in those sectors that will help us get there. And the reason we've chosen electricity generation as the first sector to do is because it's just so important. So at the moment, electricity generation accounts for about 20% of global final energy demand, but by 2050, that number will be more like 50%. So it's not the only game in town, but it is certainly absolutely crucial, and decarbonising it gets us a decent chunk of the way to net zero. And I sort of half jest in the paper when I say, but only half, when I sort of characterise humanity's strategy of achieving net zero by 2050 of electrifying everything we can and decarbonising electricity generation. So I jest because there's certainly a lot more to it than that. But it does on its own, as I said, get us a fair chunk of the way there. All right, so the format for today's presentation is that I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the paper, just some of the key points for about 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to go to question and answer. And specifically, it's when I'll bring Peter into the conversation, to really unpack in quite a bit more detail some of the key issues that we explore in the paper. So let's jump in. First of all, just to take a bit of a historical perspective, this graph looks at the world's energy supply mix over the last 220 years. So just sort of stepping back for a minute and taking a longer term perspective, because I think one interesting question is, as we go through this energy transition, as we try to reach net zero by 2050, we are clearly going to have a really pronounced change in our economies and in our energy system, and particularly in the types of energy that we use. At the moment, wind and solar are only about 3% of total energy supply, but that number needs to rise, very, very dramatically if we are to achieve net zero in over the next 3 decades or so. So can we do that, right? Like, can the economy adjust to such a fast change in the energy supply mix? I mean, our answer is clearly yes, and part of the answer is that it's done it before. So, for example, if you look back on this chart, you can see that around about 1850, coal's contribution to global energy supply just really exploded. And of course, this was the point at which the Industrial Revolution really spread to the big population centres of Germany and the US. But we had a really, really pronounced change in the world's energy supply mix as that happened, and really displaced traditional biomass, which is overwhelmingly wood. And then the other one to flag would be really the post-World War II shift towards oil, right? So after the end of World War II, when really cheap Middle Eastern supply came online and internal combustion engines and automobiles became ubiquitous, you saw an explosion in oil use right through to the 1970s. So this has happened before, and we see no reason why a global economy that's endowed, to a much greater degree with technology and the flexibility that technology brings, we see no reason why the world economy can't do it again. So, how big is the challenge? So the energy transition will obviously take some time, and so the question is not, how do we decarbonise today's economy, which is roughly $104 trillion US, and today's energy system, which consumes roughly 420 exajoules of energy? The question really is, how do we decarbonise the economy of 2050, and how do we decarbonise the energy supply of 2050? So how big will the economy be? How much energy will we be consuming then? on our calculations, the global economy would be roughly 2.2 times its current size in 2050. Now, what does that mean for energy demand? Well, if historic relationships hold, that means that energy demand will go from roughly 420 exajoules by our calculation to 480, which is the left-hand bar on this left-hand chart that you can see here. So that's if nothing changes, that's if the historical trend continues. Now, of course, you'll notice that energy demand hasn't doubled. The economy's more than doubled, energy demand hasn't doubled. So energy demand grows slower than GDP. And it grows slower than GDP for a whole range of reasons. One is that technology creates efficiencies. And so over time, that enables us to lower the energy intensity of our economies. There are structural changes in economies, right? The service sector grows at the expense of the energy-intense industrial sector. And there may also be an energy saturation effect, which is kind of the idea that you reach a certain level of income, a certain level of GDP per capita, beyond which energy demand doesn't really grow very much. Why? Well, maybe it's the case that we can only use appliances for so many hours per day. We can only cook so much food. We can only drive so many kilometers and take so many flights in a year. Now, if that effect is real, then it's really quite possible that growth in energy demand really can slow quite dramatically going forward. But for all of those reasons, that's why energy demand doesn't grow as rapidly as GDP. But just staying on the left-hand graph, if you look at what the main forecasters out there are forecasting for energy demand in 2050, you will see that their number is a lot lower than that 480. Their number is a lot lower than the historic trend continues type scenario. And in fact, BNEF, for example, have estimates that range from 391 exajoules to 395. And BP, IRENA, and IEA are all substantially below that, but around about 350 exajoules. So not only do they expect that energy demand will grow much more slowly relative to GDP than it has in the past, but energy demand will actually contract, right? So it's currently about 420, but they expect that energy demand will actually be smaller in 2050 than it is today. So how does that happen? So firstly, just to think about how big a change is this? And this is where on the right-hand side, I basically take the numbers on the left-hand side and convert them to an annual growth rate. So this is energy intensity, so energy demand per unit of GDP. And you can see historically over the last 40 years or so, energy intensity has declined by about 1.8% per year. And so based on the forecast on the left-hand side, most forecasters are expecting that number to increase to 2.5% to 3% per year. So a substantial uplift, right? A substantial improvement in our energy efficiency gains going forward. Now, it may be that structural changes in the global economy have an effect. It may be that this energy saturation type effect starts to play a bigger role as more countries and more people start to reach that critical level of GDP per capita. But there's no doubt that electrification also plays a big role in this journey. Now, electrical processes, and we'll explore this a bit more once Peter joins the conversation, but electrical processes are just generally much more efficient than power generated from fossil fuels. So an electric vehicle, for example, has a much simpler drivetrain, much lower energy losses than an internal combustion engine. More on that later. But electrifying large parts of our economy really helps to lower energy demand. On the left-hand side is electricity as a percentage of energy demand for a range of regions around the world. Globally, it's about 20% at the moment. But that is expected, as you can see in the right-hand chart, to go to around about 50% by 2050. So a really substantial electrification of our societies and our economies. So how achievable is that? Well, there's certainly a lot of work to do. But if you look back at the left-hand chart, you can see that Norway's pretty much already there, right? In Norway, electricity is around about half of energy demand. Now, its industrial sector, its household sector is much more electrified than the rest of the world. And of course, it's leading the way in EV take-up. Roughly 90% of car sales now in Norway are electric vehicles, primarily because they effectively have some really quite heavy implied carbon taxes on internal combustion engine cars. And Norway is a wealthy country. So, arguably it can afford to make some of these changes. But it is an example of a country that is basically already there. So it's certainly by no means impossible. All right. What does all of that mean for aggregate electricity demand, and what are the sector contributors to it? So in 2019, the world consumed about 22,000 terawatt hours of electricity. By 2050, that number is expected to be about 54,000. Now, the biggest contributor to the change is industry, then buildings, and then transport. But the biggest change comes in transport, because at the moment transport consumes hardly any electricity whatsoever. But as the light-duty vehicle fleet and perhaps the heavy-duty vehicle fleet starts to become electrified, we'll see a big increase in electricity demand in that space relative to where we are now. Industry, as electric boilers and furnaces become more widely adopted, and in buildings as heat pumps become ubiquitous, this will contribute significantly to the electrification of our economy. So electricity demand more than doubles. In fact, almost goes up by 2.5 times by 2050. So a big increase. The X factor, of course, is green hydrogen. Now, green hydrogen, if it becomes economically viable, or it becomes viable, then this could really move the needle in terms of electricity demand. Why? Because it's a very electricity intense process to produce green hydrogen. Again, we'll unpack this a little bit more with Peter. But if we reach a point over the next 3 decades where it's either viable because of very sharp cost falls in electrolyzers, or because of sharp increases in the cost of fossil fuels, but whatever drives it becomes economically viable, then it can see a more than doubling of electricity demand in 2050 from the current projections, right? So you could end up with as much as 113,000 terawatt hours of electricity demand in 2050 if green hydrogen is either economically viable or just viable in general, courtesy of government support. All right. How is the transition to decarbonisation of electricity generation likely to proceed? And why do we think that wind and solar will really be the mainstay of power supply for the electricity sector? Well, in short, the answer is just the cost. So this is levelized cost of energy calculations for a range of power generation technologies, and we show it here out to 2050. You can see, solar and onshore wind, even today, are easily the cheapest technology available. But that only exacerbates by 2050. So by 2050, as solar and wind costs continue to come down due to ongoing scale improvements and technological advancements, particularly potentially in solar, solar can become, by 2050, solar is expected to be about 1/6 of the cost of coal and about 1/5 of the cost of CCGTs. So, these are big changes, and we do have limited visibility, right, on these kind of projections. You can maybe see out sort of 5 or 6 years or so, but beyond that, visibility is more limited. So it needs to be seen in that light. But there's no doubt that these technologies are the cheapest, and the cheapest by some margin. So how will the transition, proceed? Well, we like to characterize it using this graph, which, and we talk about a 3-phase energy transition. So in the first phase begins when wind and solar start to enter the energy supply system. So their shares are relatively low, growing rapidly, but relatively low. And they don't really cause any problems to the grid, beyond the sort of normal flickering type problems that grid operators normally encounter. Phase 2 begins when cost-effective energy storage starts to meaningfully enter the energy system. So batteries, for example, start to replace peaker plants, and the problem here is, of course, that there's a bit of a mismatch between renewable supply and electricity demand. So solar, in particular, so peak demand is usually in the mornings when people are waking up, getting ready for work, And in the evenings when they come home from work, they cook, they eat, they turn on appliances, they shower, watch TV and the like. But of course, it's at those points in the day where the solar's output is really quite low. So while you have high demand, you have low renewable supply of power. So you need an alternative source. Now, at the moment, that is supplied by peaker plants, mainly CCGTs. But going forward, as the economics of batteries improve, and they've improved really dramatically over the last 10 years or so, we think that batteries will start to increasingly replace peaker plants for that daily energy shifting need. Phase 3 begins when the usefulness of the 24-hour storage starts to cap out, and you start to need at this point, seasonal storage to continue to drive renewables penetration of the energy supply mix. Why do you need seasonal storage? Well, for example, in some locations such as Europe, demand for power in winter is high for warming needs, but solar's output is relatively low. So how do you bridge that gap? Well, overbuilding renewables is certainly one option, but energy storage is another. But batteries are not very suited to that long duration type storage. The economics of batteries work when they're cycling very, very regularly. So options, you need some form of chemical storage most likely, and we think hydrogen is a possibility for that. But in any event, that's the sort of 3-stage energy transition as we see it. A lot of economies are either coming towards the tail end of phase 1 now, or perhaps even in the early stages of phase 2. Okay. The last section in the paper, the last thing we touch on is the capital need to affect the energy transition, and in short, it's just massive. So there are 3 areas of capital need. So one is to build out that wind and solar capacity that is necessary. Now you can see the estimates on the left-hand graph here. The average there is 20.6 trillion. But it's more than just a build out of wind and solar. We need capital for grids as well, for replacement of old grids. Some grids around the world are very old, particularly in the US. We will need to build out grids in places like emerging markets to increase coverage. But we'll also need to probably densify our transmission and distribution networks as the power supply becomes more decentralized. So wind and solar generation units are usually smaller. So they're smaller and you'll have more of them than you did under a sort of fossil fuel-based energy supply system. So that means we'll need more wires basically. So we need roughly 21 trillion for grids by 2050, according to the average of those 3 forecasters. And then energy storage is much smaller, average of about 3.2 trillion by 2050. So all of that adds up to $44.8 trillion US dollars by 2050, roughly double the size of the current US economy. You need another sort of 8.5 trillion for hydro, for nuclear, for geothermal, for biomass and the like. So it gets you to a total number by our reckoning of roughly 53.4 trillion US dollars. So around about 1.8 trillion per year. So this is for investors with the right expertise, the right timelines, and the right risk appetite. This is one of the biggest sector opportunities around at the moment. And just to put that number in perspective, for example, global asset managers currently manage about 100 trillion US dollars, give or take. So it's roughly half of all of the capital currently managed by asset managers globally. All right, so that's a quick overview. Just to wrap up quickly before I jump to Peter. Key points are energy consumption is actually expected to fall between now and 2050, even though the global economy will likely double in size. Part of that is improvements in energy efficiency, energy saturation, change in economic composition. But part of it is electrification of large swathes of our economies. Wind and solar, we think, one, they're technically capable of producing the world's electricity needs, and we think they will be the mainstay of the electricity generation sector in the decades to come. They're the cheapest form of power, and they're getting cheaper. And then lastly, the energy transition is going to require large amounts of capital from investors, again, with the right level of expertise and right time horizon. But roughly 53.4 trillion is going to be needed over the next 3 decades, or about 1.8 trillion per year. All right, that's a very quick cant through the main points from the paper, but maybe now I'll go to Peter. Peter, perhaps we could start with this question of the electrification of our economies, which I think is really interesting. So, what do you think of the estimate that 50% of energy demand can be electrified by 2050, and then perhaps we can start talking about what can be electrified within these sectors, and maybe let's start with transport. I mean, I think everybody is aware of the electrification of the light duty fleet that is going on and is happening really rapidly. But of course, it goes beyond that, right? Heavy duty vehicles, will they be electrified? Will they use hydrogen? Can we have electric planes? Can we have electric ships? How far can we take this?
Sure. So thanks for that overview. That was really good. So can we electrify 50% of the economy's final energy demand? Yeah, I think we probably can. And when we say electrify, we mean directly electrify, meaning those processes or those activities run directly on electrons. So let's maybe take transport then. You've got a few sectors here. We'll go backwards from transport, buildings, and industry. In transport, yeah, we're very bullish battery electrics for light duty, mid duty vehicles, certainly. The general consensus amongst many forecasters is that heavy duty applications, particularly heavy duty and long haul, will require hydrogen. We think there's certainly a role to play for hydrogen in there, but our view as a team is that battery electrics will potentially surprise to the upside there. So, many of the forecasts that say heavy duty can't directly electrify now also said previously that medium duty couldn't electrify, and buses couldn't electrify, and taxis couldn't electrify. So we think as energy density in batteries continues to improve, charging gets better, becomes prolific, all sorts of other models come out, we think that ground transport electrification, terrestrial transport electrification will certainly increase. And to your point about how electrification saves primary energy consumption, even though you might be getting more energy services out, meaning transport, right, wheels turning and people moving along the road and goods moving along the road, because that electric motor is 3 to 4 times, or drivetrain is 3 to 4 times more efficient, meaning energy in versus motive power out, the same amount of travel can use 1/3 or 1/4 as much primary energy in the process. So that's really one of the things that decreases the amount of input energy going into an economy to run it. And then if we think about buildings and industry, there's a lot of things obviously in buildings and industry that can directly electrify. You mentioned heat pumps earlier. Certainly we're looking at cooling. A big driver of electricity demand or energy demand in buildings is actually going to be cooling over the next 30 or 40 years as economies get wealthier, as frankly, as global temperatures increase, et cetera. We're seeing a big increase in the demand for electricity from cooling, but also the ability to switch heating and cooling over to electricity in the form of a heat pump has the potential again to have a 2 or 3x improvement in total energy consumption.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, what about planes, Peter? I mean, I understand that's kind of harder to electrify planes because of the propulsion need that you have. But I also read that sort of you can have electric planes. I think someone's trying to make them, and they can be used for up to 1,000 kilometers. Is that
well,
for real?
Yeah. So there's some aspirations. It's worth the standard kind of response you'll get from most people who would have seen over the last 10 or 15 years is that you'll see these charts that compare the energy density of a battery to, say, gasoline or aviation fuels or diesel, kerosene, et cetera, and it's this incredible difference of 100x greater in terms of energy per kilogram or something. What's worth noting, though, is that you have to then say, okay, well, how much of that energy in the fossil fuel, the liquid fuel, actually gets used? Most of it's, or much of it's, lost in the form of heat and noise and pollution and friction and all that sort of thing. So, that gap starts to close, and then maybe as we double, the energy density of batteries over time, that gap gets a bit narrower. Nobody really expects that a battery electric plane is ever going to, or in any foreseeable future in the next decades, be a London to Sydney or San Francisco to Tokyo type flight. But to your point, there actually are battery electric planes already. You can fly them today. The little two-seater pipistrel type things like a Cessna, some people might know, these little kind of general aviation aircraft that will do short distances. There are companies now working on something that's more akin to a business jet that might do something like 600 nautical miles, carry 50 people or 40 people or whatever, and do shorter distances, but would be quieter and zero emission. But I think generally speaking, if you look at the bulk of energy demand in aviation, it's still going to come from a molecule. It'll still come from either hydrogen or hydrogen derivative, a biofuel, some kind of ready drop-in solution. There are also lots of work around hybridizing aircraft. So just like we've seen with the original hybrid cars and diesel electric trains and things like that, where you might have an electric motor that helps you get off the ground, helps you taxi around, et cetera, or helps keep you in the air and use the fuel for the really heavy energy stuff, energy intensive stuff of getting you off the ground. So there's certainly roles to play for electrification in aviation, but I'd say it's relatively limited in the grand scheme of things. But as I mentioned before, it's not necessarily directly electrified thing, but it's something that can be second order electrification, i.e. using electrons to make molecules. Maybe we'll come on to that a bit later. The other big sector that people think about is also ships. So what can we do with ships? Now, there are battery electric ships, certainly short distance ferries, inland barges, that kind of thing. There's actually some really good work in places, again, like Norway, that already have some battery electric ferries, car ferries, and certainly hybrids, and then lots of work out there now to electrify big chunks of that fleet that aren't doing particularly long distances. They're doing a fairly high duty cycle, but it's for short trips. But when you start thinking about long haul ships and heavy ships like container vessels and bulk carriers, you're talking then about, again, needing a molecule of some kind because of that energy density issue.
Yeah. And I mean, just before we maybe go to green hydrogen, which is a very interesting subject, I mean, maybe just to touch on industry for a second, because in this graph, which is the BNEF's numbers, I mean, the contribution from industry is really very sizable, right? It's 12,000 terawatt hours. Is it realistic to think that we can get some electrification, in the industrial space? Are electric furnaces and the like going to take off? Are they technically viable? And then secondly, how far away are they from being cost effective? Let's answer it that way.
Yeah, so there's generally in industry, it's a need for heat or cooling, and for heat that tends to be met with things like natural gas and coal, especially where you have really high temperature heats that are needed. There's a lot of industry though where the temperatures required actually aren't all that high, and that's where things like medium to high temperature heat pumps certainly work. Things like textiles and food processing and the beverage industry and that sort of thing. These are actually pretty energy hungry industries, but where certain of those applications can definitely be electrified, and many of the companies in that sector or those sectors are already trying to do that. The areas where you start getting into really high temperature and what you can do with electricity, that's a bit further out, but not impossible. I mean, things like steel recycling, we already have electric arc furnaces, right? That do exist today, and they account for a large chunk of steel manufacturing. But there's other processes that people are working on that are quite a bit earlier stage, in things like electrolytic steel. There's interesting work out of places like MIT and some other startups in that space that are looking at effectively using electricity for the steel production industry for virgin steel. And then for other areas, can we start getting heat pumps at really, really temperatures? Remains to be seen. I mean, theoretically, yes, definitely possible. But I think even in the absence of electrifying those really, really tough sectors, you're still going to see these big increases in electricity demand because of all these other kind of low to medium temp locations.
Yeah. And so maybe now let's go to indirect electrification. So green hydrogen, which is, I think, an endlessly fascinating topic. I mean, for people who don't know what green hydrogen is and how it's created, could you just give us sort of 2 minutes on the basics? Yeah,
sure. So one often hears that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and that sort of tagline gets thrown out there a lot. The problem with that is that for the most part, hydrogen is usually attached to something else. Most people know it as H2O or water, one of the most common forms that we'd see hydrogen, but also hydrocarbons, right? Fossil fuels, natural gas is CH4, methane, carbon 4 hydrogens. Green hydrogen is a process of using clean electrons, generally renewable electrons, to split water apart into its constituent parts of H2 and hydrogen and oxygen through a process called electrolysis. Electrolysis has been around for over 100 years. It's been used in industrial processes for many decades. Many people in sort of grade school chemistry class or physics class would have played around a bit with this by sticking electrical current into water and splitting that water where you get bubble streams of oxygen and hydrogen. So the idea behind green hydrogen is that by taking those clean electrons and being able to turn them into clean molecules, you can get the benefit of the decarbonization from green electricity into the sectors that require molecules, where either because of energy density or the amount of energy that needs to be stored or something along that line, where that molecule really becomes crucial. Now, there are other forms of hydrogen we can make, including low carbon hydrogen. So-called blue hydrogen is natural gas with carbon capture and storage, and pink hydrogen is using the same electrolysis process with nuclear energy. There's lots of different colors of the hydrogen rainbow, so to speak. But the real important element of this is, can you do them and make this hydrogen with low carbon life cycle emissions? Green hydrogen is seen by most analysts, BF, IEA, etc., as ultimately winning on price. So to your point earlier, as solar and wind just continue to get cheaper and cheaper, and if we can see the same kind of what's called a learning curve in manufacturing on electrolyzers that we've seen in batteries and solar panels and wind turbines, then the capex around electrolyzers get cheaper and cheaper. And over time, green hydrogen becomes cheaper than any other alternative for that clean molecule. Now, that's accelerated a bit in the last 6 months, given the world energy crisis, steep increases in natural gas prices. So there have been points where green hydrogen is already cheaper than blue hydrogen or even gray hydrogen, or in some cases, maybe even natural gas. But, nobody certainly doesn't expect and doesn't hope that those kind of elevated natural gas prices are permanent. So we think that this is a blip, but that the trend over time is that green hydrogen becomes cheaper than high carbon hydrogen.
Yeah. And I was amazed to sort of learn when researching this paper that sustainable fuels were produced as early as sort of World War II, right? The UK and Germany produced a huge amount actually of synthetic oil during that period. And I think there's some figure in Daniel Jürgen's famous book, The Prize, that roughly half of Germany's oil came from actually synthetic oil production during the war years, which is an incredible number. But I mean, it was obviously quite expensive, and we had cheap Middle East oil come after the war, and of course they have these are big plants that can easily be bombed, and so it wasn't sustainable. But it's certainly a technology that's been around for a long time. Yeah. And
just worth maybe just jumping in on the synthetic oil that's around, called the Fischer-Tropsch process. It's worth noting, just for listeners, so they don't get too excited, that was actually very dirty oil. That was taking coal and making syngas out of it and separating out the hydrogen from coal and then using that to make oil. So it was it could be done, but we'll reap the benefits of the Fischer-Tropsch process if we ever decide to start making synthetic hydrocarbons, which is taking a clean form of hydrogen, some sort of sustainable source of carbon, and then synthesizing those together, hence synfuels, and be able to make a synthetic hydrocarbon that has a carbon neutral aspect to it.
Yeah, got it. And could you just step the audience through, like, what are the use cases for hydrogen? What are some of the specific use cases for hydrogen? So they're obviously sort of buses use hydrogen. You can mix it with natural gas for heating. But if you could just step through some of those, because it has an enormous number of use cases.
Absolutely. So let's maybe start with the electric sector, just given the three phases of electricity sector energy transition you showed earlier. One that people often identify as long-term energy storage. So to your point that electrochemical batteries as we have them today are not going to be economic to store energy for months at a time, or weeks, and certainly not months at a time. Whereas something like hydrogen is one of those options where you can take surplus renewable electricity, turn it into hydrogen. There's big energy loss there, but then you store that energy and you can store it well in underground caverns and things, just like we store natural gas today for long periods of time, and then bring that back out and turn it back into electricity either via gas turbines, which are being sort of retrofitted now to be able to burn hydrogen, or reciprocating engines, or fuel cells. So that's one in the power sector. But then beyond kind of decarbonizing the power sector, hydrogen can be used for many things, right? So it can be used directly in heavy transport, as we mentioned, via fuel cells. So that could be heavy long haul trucks, it could be short haul ships, and those are applications that are in use today. It can be used potentially in aircraft. So Airbus and others are actually looking at hydrogen aircraft. The volumetric energy density of hydrogen is very low, meaning the amount of energy per volume, per sort of cubic meter. So they're looking at new airframe designs, new shapes of aircraft effectively that can account for that and theoretically run long distance aviation on hydrogen. Or you can take that hydrogen and combine it with a sustainable form of carbon that you might get from biomass waste or something like that, and turn that into a synthetic jet fuel. Another area that's interesting is you can start combining that hydrogen with nitrogen. Most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And the way we make ammonia today is NH3, nitrogen, and 3 hydrogens. That's a big feedstock into the petroleum refining industry, but also the ammonia industry as fertilizers. So looking at the use of hydrogen as a feedstock in the chemicals industry is a really big one. And then also incremental uses for ammonia. So for things like ships. So right now, MAN Shipping and Maersk and others are all looking at different alternative fuels that can run big, heavy tanker ships and cargo ships. So methanol, which is again a synthetic hydrocarbon, or we can make it synthetically, it's a hydrocarbon, or using ammonia that we make with green hydrogen are really quite exciting applications for where green hydrogen can go to help decarbonize the sector that without some form of sustainable molecule and low carbon or no carbon molecule, we're not going to be able to decarbonize it readily. Yeah. And lastly, is in steel. Well, not lastly, but another one that's interesting is in steel. So using hydrogen as an alternative to coking coal. So metallurgical coal, where we would often use that for what's called the iron reduction process, being able to use hydrogen to directly reduce iron and remove the coal from that process. So there are a few steel companies in Sweden who are working on this now and producing the first zero carbon steel. I think Volvo is the company that most recently announced the purchase of that, which is pretty interesting. But many of the other large steel makers around the world are all starting to look into using green hydrogen for steel production.
Yeah. So maybe to put you on the spot a little bit, but I mean, hydrogen is fascinating, right? I mean, the number of use cases for it is incredible. I mean, do you think it's going to be viable? I remember I did an assignment at college/university, and it was on nuclear fusion, and this was sort of late 90s, and it said that nuclear fusion was commercially 20 to 30 years away. Well, it's sort of getting around almost 25 years since I did that little paper, and it's still still probably 30 years from being commercially viable. Is hydrogen the same, or is it potentially for real? Like, do you think we will see green hydrogen being viable in large quantities before 2050?
I certainly do, and the fusion one's a good example where the joke in the industry, or several jokes that are worth noting. One is that nuclear fusion is 40 years away and has been for 50 years, and the other one historically with hydrogen is that hydrogen is the fuel of the future and always will be. So it's been touted for well over a century. In fact, Jules Verne and others, so even older than you, Daniel, Jules Verne and others were making comments about how hydrogen's the fuel of the future and we could power the world on it, et cetera. And that was over a century ago. But a couple of things have fundamentally changed. So where I was a much more of a hydrogen skeptic, say 20 years ago, the reason that I'm much less of that skeptic now, in fact, getting quite bullish the application or certain applications of green hydrogen, not all, but many. A couple of things. One is that the cost of making a clean electron has absolutely plummeted, right? So we've seen a 20 or 30x reduction in the cost of input electrons. And what you'll find as you start going deep into green hydrogen is that the cost of those electrons end up being the bulk of the levelized cost of hydrogen, right? So without low-cost clean electrons, you can't make low-cost clean hydrogen, or at least not electrolytic hydrogen, meaning using electrons to split water. The other thing is that even for blue hydrogen, so blue hydrogen is that made with natural gas and carbon capture, other than what we're seeing at the moment, natural gas costs have come down an awful lot over the last 20 years, present spike excluded. If those costs can come back down, you have two avenues where all of a sudden the ability to make low carbon hydrogen is interesting. And then thirdly is that we are seeing where all the different areas we can directly electrify. And if all we wanted to do, I say inverted commas, only a 50% reduction or whatever in global emissions, then we might not need hydrogen. But if you say, well, I don't want to get to minus 50% or minus 60%, I want to get to minus 100% or 90 or 80, you're going to need molecules to do that. So there's certain parts of the economy that we just can't electrify. So you have a lot more government support for this now. And again, governments, regulators we speak to often, they've started to understand the dynamic that, we supported renewables and they got much cheaper. We supported battery and deployment and they got much cheaper over time through Wright's Law. If we can support the demand for low carbon hydrogen, can we continue the cost declines in renewable energy, but also kickstart the cost declines in electrolyzers? So the bit of capex that you need in order to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So I think regulators are really seeing how that can work. Companies are seeing how it can work, and associated technologies are getting cheaper. So I do think it'll happen. I don't think it's going to be enormous scale overnight, but we're and many others around the world are working on projects and ideas around this and finding applications for it. So I think it'll take a bit of time to scale. It'll take several years to really start getting large scale production, but we're already seeing these like larger than pilot scale projects coming online now. And I think if you look at all the outlooks and the targets and goals from the European Union, from the UK government, from Korea, Japan, the US, Canada, et cetera, Australia, there's big chunky targets that they have in place, and they're starting to put finance behind it. So I do think we'll get the scale out of that. And yes, before we'll see nuclear fusion at economic scale.
Fantastic. So maybe we could just switch gears, but only slightly, and just sort of talk a little bit about wind and solar and their cost evolution. So the cost of wind and solar has just fallen absolutely dramatically over the last 10 years, even over the last 20. Could you just walk the audience through what the drivers of that are?
Sure. Well, let's maybe start with wind, because wind's been around at scale longer. So both wind and solar benefit from something that in economics is known as Wright's Law, or the learning curve effect. So that with each cumulative doubling of making a thing, the cost of making that thing drops by some fixed percent. I mean, this was discovered, in World War II, and it's worked in all kinds of industries, from widgets and semiconductors and turbines and you name it. So the learning curve for wind, I don't remember the percentage offhand, it's something like 15 to 20%, meaning with every doubling of manufactured capacity of wind turbines, they get cheaper. That isn't any breakthrough in technology per se. It's an evolutionary improvement where, some of that is a scale effect. We make them individually bigger. We make the factories that make them bigger. We make them more efficient. We make the operation and maintenance better, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen wind really come down in cost from, hundreds of dollars many hundreds of dollars a megawatt hour to $10, $20, $30 a megawatt hour in the best cases around the world in the last, say, 30 years. Solar really only started scaling with being deployed at any real scale around the turn of this century with the Energiewende in Germany, or the energy transition through feed-in tariffs. And so you went from an industry that was a few megawatts of manufacturing capacity a year, used primarily in satellites and some military technology and really remote power applications, starting in sort of the mid-2000s, really started ramping up with rooftop solar support and feed-in tariff support schemes in Europe. And it's worth noting that I'm going to say it was 2006 or 2006-07, was the first time that the world ever deployed in 1 year 1 gigawatt of solar. Fast forward a decade later, in 2017, we did 100 gigawatts of solar. So you had a 100x increase in the manufacturing and the deployment of solar in a decade. We're currently on track for over 200 gigawatts this year, and many of the outlooks have us getting to 400 or 500 gigawatts. And we've asked the question, well, why not 1 terawatt or 2 terawatts a year? Not a prediction, but just a what if. Is there a functional limit? Solar, things worth noting too is, in my lifetime, the cost of solar has dropped something like 99.5x. It's unbelievably, or 99.5%. It absolutely incredible. But again, it's still the same underlying technology. It's a single junction solar photovoltaic crystalline cell. And all that means is that we've gotten incredibly more efficient at how we make these. The efficiency of the modules themselves have improved. So the amount of sunlight that gets converted into electrons has gone from less than 1% to 20%. So that's a 20-fold increase. And therefore, the associated land and materials and labor and cabling and all that stuff has dropped. What we're seeing going forward is a continuation of that energy efficiency improvement on solar, There's lots of technology out there where we think we can have very significant increases in efficiency, which can again radically reduce or continue that reduction in solar cost. And wind is an interesting one where you mentioned offshore wind here on your chart. Offshore wind, onshore wind has benefited from scale, meaning turbines get bigger. But that effect has been really extreme in offshore wind, where the first offshore wind turbines were a couple of megawatts. Now they're 14, or 15 megawatts. These machines, when you see the top of the blade of an offshore wind turbine, it's roughly the top of the Eiffel Tower. These are incredibly large pieces of kit, and very big, heavy engineering behind it. Whereas solar is almost the opposite end of the spectrum because of its modularity. Its ability to keep coming down that cost curve quickly really matters. But it's not that one's better or worse necessarily. It's that certain renewable technologies make more sense in certain locations based on the resources that they have.
Yeah, right. And maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about some of the issues that are often raised in a renewables-based energy system. Some of the challenges that people see, and I mean some are very real, and others are perhaps a little bit less real from a factual basis. But what about the notion, Peter, that we'll just need so much solar and wind that we just won't have the space. We won't be able to grow anything or drive down the street. The solar panels will be everywhere. Ships will be running into wind turbines at sea. Is that going to happen if we have a wind and solar based power system?
Well, we'll start from the first principles and imagine if we had just wind or just solar. But it is worth noting that, of course, we won't have just wind or just solar. Where there's geothermal power and hydropower and existing nuclear and all that kind of stuff, those will continue. But if we start at first principles, the amount of sunlight that lands on the land surface of Earth every year is many thousands of times greater than humanity's total energy demand. So, we've run these numbers and many others have said this before us, but, it's a simple one-tab spreadsheet actually to do the numbers. You need something like 0.6 or 0.5% of the land area of the world to generate 100% of current primary energy demand, right? So, and that's at existing technology efficiency, meaning conversion of sunlight into electrons. And that also includes for making hydrogen and all that kind of stuff. So at a global level, land is not a constraining factor for solar. Wind takes up more space, meaning, area affected, but actually the footfall of wind is quite small because you can dual use the land quite easily, as we see with agriculture and ranching and all that sort of thing. Where it does change a bit, though, is depending on where you are, right? So if you're a land-constrained area, if you're Australia, that's one thing, with 20 million people on a continent. If you're South Korea, for example, where you have very high energy or high population density, and you don't have tons of solar and you don't have lots of flat land, and the wind resource isn't as great, well, then that's more of a constraint. So it really will depend a bit by country. But what we see is that even in countries like the UK, which is deemed to be quite dense from a population point of view, the ability to generate our electricity from wind and solar is very doable, especially because of offshore wind. If you look at much of the world, including big population countries like China, the US, India, Brazil, etc., that have hundreds of millions or even billions of people, or over 1 billion people each, the ability to generate the energy they need from wind and solar is certainly doable. So, is there enough resource? Yes. Is there enough land on a global and regional basis? Yes. Will certain countries have to look at importing energy? Back to you finding green hydrogen interesting, or increased grid connections and all that sort of thing? Yeah, you still have to get the energy to where it's needed. But it is worth saying that, so it used to be that 15 years ago, everybody thought you would generate solar in the deserts in North Africa and bring it to Europe, or in Arizona and bring it to New York kind of thing. Now, as solar itself has gotten so much cheaper, one can generate solar in Scotland for less than the price one was able to generate solar in the Sahara Desert 10 years ago. So, it's worth noting that people build solar in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh because it's cheaper than buying it from the grid. Now, it doesn't get you all year round. It's pretty dark in a Scottish winter. But, the cost of solar has come down so much that areas that wouldn't have seemed logical for solar in the past are now becoming viable.
Yeah, great, Peter. I mean, we seem to have lost my video, but let's just continue with audio from my side only. But Peter, last two questions. So nuclear. Nuclear is talked about a lot in a net zero world, and that nuclear can potentially provide, the base load of reliable power that solar and wind struggle with a little bit because of their intermittent nature. I think you're quite negative about nuclear, if I'm right. Could you just talk us through why you think nuclear, won't be a significant component of the sort of electricity supply in decades to come?
Yeah, I wouldn't classify myself as negative per se. I'd say I'm agnostic on nuclear, but also, I have a grocery list of issues with nuclear, and high on that list is cost, right? The cost and time to build, and the nuclear industry does not have a great track record over the last decades across many different markets in this space. Nuclear, you can certainly convince me, is valuable. As you said, it's essentially always on power. It might be 80 or 90% of the time, or even a bit more in some places. But it's not cheap. The one thing I would say is that we often hear we need baseload power, as though if we have baseload power, that's the answer to everything. In reality, what we need is dispatchable power, flexible dispatchable power. We need the ability to generate an electron when we need the electron. So our load is not flat. We don't use the same amount of electricity or energy throughout the day, all day, every month, and every season of the year. What we do is have a varying electricity load, even within days and within hours. And nuclear, whilst it's technically possible to ramp up and down, it's not an easy thing to do, and doesn't really, or makes even less economic sense because you have to turn it, because it's so expensive from a capex point of view, you want to run it as much as you possibly can in order to amortize over more units. But yeah, there's a long grocery list with nukes around time to build, around safety issues. Nuclear has a decent safety record if you compare it to something like coal, in terms of the number of people that have died from the industry, including accidents. Coal is much worse. Coal miners and pollution and air pollution, that sort of thing. There's also a weapons issue with nuclear around proliferation of weapons. It's one of the reasons that the International Energy Agency, Atomic Energy Agency, exists, is to try and control nuclear technology. But there's where I'm hopeful about nukes is that there are lots of different approaches and different technologies that people have worked on. Things called like small modular reactors or advanced modular reactors, alternative fuels, so not using uranium, using things like thorium. These are all well understood within the sort of energy industry, or at least somewhat understood in the energy industry. But kind of like your fusion point from earlier, they're 10 years away now, and they've been 10 years away for an awful time, like decades. So I wouldn't hold my breath necessarily that we're going to see these scale. But I think if governments decide to back these and the industry actually comes up with a way to do these at scale, it's a maybe. And if they can address all the concerns around safety and nuclear weapons proliferation and fuel supply and all that sort of thing, the waste issue is a concern many have. Then nuclear can possibly play a bigger future. So it's a scenario that many, like Bloomberg and the IEA and others, run scenarios that if nuclear can do the following, then great. Where I'm skeptical and why I'm more bullish on the renewables front is we've already seen that renewables can and have become the cheapest form of electricity we've ever had and can continue to become cheaper over time. And then you have to ask the question, is a largely renewable plus battery plus hydrogen system better, more effective, cheaper, more dispersed, more resilient than a nuclear one? So I think the latter is true. I think the renewable power sector ends up being more attractive on a global basis. But certainly I think existing nuclear reactors that are safe should keep running, just a personal opinion. But nuclear won't happen without significant government intervention on behalf of it.
Okay, yeah, got it. And last question, and a discussion like this would not be complete without us talking about the carbon price. And as a trained economist with a degree in economics and a background in economics, I'm brought up on the religion, that the carbon price solves all problems. I.e., the problem is there's externalities in fossil fuels; those are not paid for by the user. You put in anything that's roughly appropriate in terms of carbon price, you're just going to get a much more efficient outcome. And things are roughly appropriately priced. You let markets do their thing in terms of allocating resources efficiently, and so that's the optimal solution. I I know you have a different view, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, but as I understand it, you think that using subsidies to get scale is just ultimately kind of a cheaper way of achieving what you want to achieve. Is that right?
Yeah, sort of. So, I mean, I agree with you that the theory of how markets work and how carbon pricing would work, that would be a very efficient way to do it. But as I've said to many before, we can prove that having a carbon price is not a prerequisite for clean technologies to scale. And the examples that we can give are things like the nuclear industry, which we just talked about. France got from no nuclear to 70 or 80% of its electricity from nuclear, and it did it without a carbon price. It did it because effectively a government picked a winner and said this is an industrial strategy we want to pursue for a host of reasons, right? For national security reasons above all. Energy crises and the oil shocks in the 70s. Things like renewables have not gotten cheaper because of the carbon price. That 99% whatever reduction energy has come because we've scaled deployment, not because of either a carbon price or just support R&D. That's another sort of chestnut that people often say is we just need to support R&D. Same thing with wind, same thing with electric vehicles. Batteries are 80% cheaper now than they were 10 years ago. Why is that? Because we supported their deployment. We understand, again, an economic law, a rights law in manufacturing, that as we deploy these technologies and we scale them and we learn incrementally by doing, the costs come down. So I think at a societal level, what we're seeing already with the incredible increases in energy price is effectively the equivalent of a very, very high carbon price. The doubling, tripling, quintupling, 10x of natural gas prices, depending on where you are in the world. It is an extremely high carbon price equivalent. And so it ends up being a bit of a blunt instrument. So the ability to support, a couple of industries, what we know are going to be big parts of the solution, or that we think can be very big parts or foundational solutions going forward, we can subsidize their deployment without necessarily penalizing the alternative until such time as the alternative, or until the new technology is at somewhere close to or even below cost competitiveness or cost parity with the status quo. So instead of just penalizing people and then hoping industry figures out how to deploy these things or invent and then deploy these things, in many cases, there's a big, long kind of ramping time that's needed to get these technologies to scale. So that's what we're seeing governments do in many markets, where carbon price can give really good signals for fuel switching, say between coal and natural gas, or natural gas without CCS and natural gas with CCS, carbon capture and storage. Just as a blunt instrument across the economy, I get the theory, but I also just don't know that we're going to see that anytime soon. It's been one of those things that's 10 years away, that we're going to have economy-wide carbon prices for a long time. And I just don't know if the political will is there to do it. But generally speaking, regardless of one's sort of political leanings, there's usually more support to be had for supporting the deployment of early stage technology, provided those technologies get cheaper or prove that they can get cheaper over time.
Yeah, got it. Okay, great, Peter. Well, thanks very much. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, and the energy transition is certainly a trend that is not going away. And as I said in my initial remarks, huge amount of capital need in this space for investors with the appropriate skill set and time horizon. For those investors who have got questions for us, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'd love to receive questions, and we'll come back to you with an appropriate answer. Otherwise, just thanks very much for dialing in. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and of course, please feel free to access the paper either through the webinar dashboard or via the Savvy Investor website. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.